Between 1950 and 1970, American church picnic tables overflowed with homemade desserts that cost less than $1 and fed entire congregations. Church ladies competed to bring the moistest cakes, crispiest cookies, and most impressive pies using Depression-era techniques and simple pantry ingredients. Campbell's soup became cake. Bible verses turned into fruitcake recipes. Burnt sugar created mysterious flavors. By the 1980s, store-bought convenience replaced these traditions. These are 30 forgotten church picnic desserts from the 1950s that no one makes anymore, starting with the one that hid Campbell's soup inside. The most popular dessert at every 1950s church picnic was a spice cake that tasted amazing, but nobody could guess the secret ingredient. Church ladies across the Midwest used a 10-cent can of Campbell's tomato soup instead of butter and eggs. The soup made the cake super moist, and it stayed soft, even after sitting outside in the heat for hours. Women mixed everything in one bowl, poured it into a big pan, and baked it for 30 minutes. They sprinkled powdered sugar on top and cut it into squares. The whole cake cost just 50 cents and fed 12 people at the picnic. You couldn't taste the tomato at all. It just made the cake incredibly soft and delicious. Kids would eat 3 pieces without ever knowing they were eating vegetables. The cake traveled well in covered dishes and never crumbled when you cut it. Comment below if your grandma ever made a cake with Campbell's soup, or did she keep that secret from you too? This coffee cake got its funny name when a teenager won a Pillsbury baking contest in 1954 by creating a dessert that made all the boys at church picnics come back for seconds. Fresh blueberries were folded into a simple yellow cake batter. Then the whole thing was topped with cinnamon sugar before baking. The berries burst during baking and created sweet purple pockets throughout the cake. What made it perfect for picnics was the sugar topping that formed a crunchy crust, so you didn't need any frosting that would melt in the sun. Women baked it in a 9x13 pan and cut it into squares that kids could grab and eat while running around playing games. At 75 cents per batch, it used whatever berries were in season, fresh in summer, frozen in winter. The cake stayed moist for 2 days. Tell us in the comments, would this cake have worked on the boys at your church picnic? Every church picnic had at least one grandmother who brought this simple hot milk cake with a coconut topping that nobody could stop eating. The cake itself was basic, just eggs, sugar, flour, hot milk, and vanilla mixed together and baked until golden. But here's where it got special. The moment it came out of the oven, you spread a mixture of brown sugar, butter, coconut, and cream on top, then put it back under the broiler for 3 minutes. The topping bubbled and caramelized into a crunchy, sweet crust that tasted like candy. It got the name Lazy Daisy because it was so easy that even the laziest cook could make it perfectly. The whole thing cost just 60 cents, and you didn't need a mixer or any fancy equipment. Women made it in the morning, let it cool, and carried it to the picnic in the same pan. If your family called this cake something different, every region had their own name for it.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Now this one is going to split the comment section. If you grew up in the South, you know exactly what this is. But Northerners might be scratching their heads. You made this entire cake in one saucepan on the stove by boiling raisins, sugar, water, shortening, and spices together for 5 minutes. After it cooled down, you stirred in flour and baking soda, then poured everything into a pan and baked it. The boiling process plumped up the raisins and mixed all the flavors together so perfectly that the cake tasted like it took hours to make. It stayed incredibly moist because of all that fruit, and it actually tasted better the next day. At 55 cents per cake, this was the cheapest dessert you could bring to a church picnic. No mixer, no creaming butter, No complicated steps, just boil, stir, and bake. Comment your state and tell us if boiled raisin cake showed up at your church picnics. If your church had a preacher who loved dessert, somebody definitely made this pineapple sheet cake and named it after him. The cake batter was simple, but you stirred in crushed pineapple with all its juice, which made the cake so moist it almost seemed wet. While it baked, you made a topping by boiling together sugar, evaporated milk, butter, coconut, and chopped pecans. The moment the cake came out of the oven, you poured this hot mixture all over the top and let it soak in. The result was a sweet, sticky, tropical-flavored cake that stayed soft for 3 days and got better as it sat. At 70 cents per batch, this became the most requested dessert at every church function. Preachers would take home the leftovers, which is probably how it got its name. Did your church make preacher cake? These first 5 desserts prove that 1950s church ladies were absolute geniuses at creating incredible desserts for almost no money. They used canned soup, crushed pineapple, and boiled raisins to make cakes that stayed perfect in summer heat, and fed dozens of people for under $1. This dessert caused arguments at every church picnic because some people called them magic bars, others called them 7-layer bars, and a few regions called them Hello Dolly bars. No matter the name, they were always the first dessert to disappear from the table. You started with a graham cracker crust pressed into a pan, then layered on chocolate chips, butterscotch chips, shredded coconut, and chopped pecans. The magic happened when you poured a can of sweetened condensed milk over everything and baked it until golden and bubbly. The condensed milk melted down through all the layers and held everything together like glue. These bars were perfect for picnics because they were portable, required no frosting, and tasted amazing at room temperature. At 75 cents per batch, they looked fancy, but took only 10 minutes to assemble. Comment what your family called these bars. Let's settle the name debate once and for all. The smartest church ladies made this cake because it used cheap oatmeal as the main ingredient and still tasted like $1,000,000. You poured boiling water over oats and let them sit while you mixed up the rest of the batter with brown sugar, eggs, and just a little flour. After baking, you made a topping from butter, brown sugar, coconut, and cream. Spread it on the warm cake, then stuck it under the broiler until it bubbled and turned golden. That broiled coconut topping became crunchy and caramelized, almost like the top of a crème brûlée. The cake stayed incredibly moist because the oats absorbed all that moisture and held onto it for days. At 55 cents per cake, this fed a crowd without breaking the bank. You could make it the night before, and it tasted even better the next day. Tell us, was this a regional secret nobody told you about? If you grew up in the Midwest or anywhere near Canada, you know these date squares were at every single church event. And if you're from the South, you probably have no idea what we're talking about. These weren't really cake at all. They were thick date fillings sandwiched between layers of buttery oat crumble. You cooked chopped dates with water and sugar until they turned into a thick, sweet paste. Then you pressed an oat mixture into a pan, spread the date filling on top, and added another layer of oats. After baking, you cut them into squares that were chewy, sweet, and incredibly filling. They got the name matrimonial cake because the 2 oat layers came together perfectly, just like a marriage. At 60 cents per batch, these bars were sturdy enough to wrap individually and hand out at outdoor picnics. Drop your location below. Is this the first time you're hearing about date squares? This was the easiest cake any grandmother ever made, and somehow it always turned out perfectly light and tender. You heated milk and butter together until the butter melted, then you poured it into beaten eggs and sugar and stirred in flour. That was it. No creaming, no complicated steps, just mix and bake. The hot milk created steam in the batter that made the cake rise tall and stay incredibly soft. Most women baked it in a sheet pan and served it plain with just powdered sugar on top, because the cake itself tasted so good it didn't need frosting. At 45 cents per cake, this was the absolute cheapest dessert you could make that still impressed everyone. Kids loved it because it was sweet but not too rich, and adults loved it because it paired perfectly with coffee. Now, if you didn't grow up in Pennsylvania Amish country, you've probably never heard of this pie. But if you did, you know exactly why it showed up at every church gathering. This was a simple custard pie filled with raisins that got its sad name because Amish families always served it at funerals and memorial meals. You cooked raisins with water, sugar, and a little cornstarch until they thickened into a sweet filling, poured it into a pie crust, and baked it until set. The pie was sturdy enough to travel well, didn't need refrigeration, and could be made the day before any event. At 65 cents per pie, it used simple pantry ingredients that every Amish and Mennonite household always had on hand. The raisins made it sweet, and the custard made it creamy, so it satisfied everyone's dessert craving. This pie splits the country right down the middle. If you grew up in Pennsylvania Dutch country or the Midwest, this was at every single church picnic. But if you're from the South or West Coast, you're probably wondering what in the world we're talking about. This custard pie was filled with plump raisins suspended in a creamy sour cream filling that was sweet, tangy, and absolutely addictive. You made it by cooking raisins with sugar, eggs, sour cream, and just a touch of cinnamon and nutmeg until everything thickened into a smooth custard. Then you poured it into a pre-baked pie shell and let it chill until firm. The sour cream gave it a slight tang that balanced out the sweetness of the raisins perfectly, and the spices made it taste warm and comforting even when served cold. At 75 cents per pie, this dessert used ingredients that farm families always had in their kitchens: fresh eggs from the chickens, sour cream from the dairy, and dried raisins from the pantry. The pie sliced beautifully and held its shape even after sitting on a picnic table for hours in the sun. Women would make 2 or 3 of these pies at a time because they knew they'd disappear fast. Kids who claimed they hated raisins would eat this pie without complaining because the creamy filling made everything taste amazing. It was one of those desserts that tasted even better the next day, after all the flavors had time to blend together in the refrigerator. Comment your state and tell us, was sour cream raisin pie a church staple where you grew up? Or have you never seen this pie in your entire life? Church potluck had at least one fancy-looking dessert that seemed too elegant for a picnic, and Swedish creme was usually it. This wasn't technically a cake or pie. It was a silky smooth almond-flavored cream that set up firm enough to unmold onto a plate and top with fresh berries. Church ladies made it by heating cream, sugar, and gelatin together until everything dissolved, then stirring in sour cream and almond extract before pouring it into individual molds or one large dish. After chilling for several hours, the dessert became firm and creamy at the same time, almost like a cross between pudding and panna cotta. The almond flavoring made it taste sophisticated and different from every other dessert on the table. Women loved serving this because it looked impressive, but only cost 55 cents to make and required no baking whatsoever during hot summer months. You could make it 2 days ahead, and it just got better as it sat in the refrigerator. At picnics, ladies would bring it in small glass cups with strawberries or raspberries on top, and people always asked for the recipe. The sour cream gave it a slight tang that kept it from being too sweet, and the almond extract made it smell absolutely incredible. Swedish families passed this recipe down through generations, and it eventually spread to every church cookbook in the Midwest. Did Swedish creme show up at your church gatherings? Now this dessert is going to make some of you argue, because half the country calls it Apple Brown Betty, and the other half calls it Apple Crisp, but they're actually two different things. Brown Betty was the older, simpler version that church ladies made during the Depression, when they couldn't afford fancy ingredients. Instead of an oat topping like Apple Crisp, Brown Betty used buttered breadcrumbs layered with spiced apples and just a little brown sugar. You tore up stale bread into chunks, tossed them with melted butter, then layered them in a pan with sliced apples that had been mixed with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar. You repeated the layers until you ran out of ingredients, ending with breadcrumbs on top. During baking, the breadcrumbs turned golden and crunchy, while the apples softened and released their juice, which soaked into the bread layers and created a texture that was part pudding, part crisp. At 50 cents per pan, this dessert used up stale bread that would otherwise get thrown away and whatever apples were available from the orchard or grocery store. It served warm or cold, and people loved it either way. The smell of cinnamon apples baking would drift across the entire church picnic grounds and draw people to the dessert table before lunch was even finished. Women made this in rectangular pans that were easy to transport and serve outdoors. Did your family call this something completely different in your part of the country? This cake is one of those forgotten desserts that used to be absolutely everywhere, and now almost nobody makes it anymore. The name sounds strange, but it came from the caramelized sugar syrup that flavored the entire cake and gave it a deep, mysterious taste that nobody could quite identify. You started by melting white sugar in a pan until it turned dark amber and started to smoke. That's where the burnt part came in. Then you very carefully added hot water to stop the cooking, creating a thick caramel syrup that you'd mix right into the cake batter. This syrup gave the cake a gorgeous golden color and a flavor that was part caramel, part butterscotch, with a slight bitter edge that made it taste sophisticated and grown up. Church ladies made this as a layer cake, with caramel frosting for special occasions, or as a simple sheet cake with just powdered sugar for regular picnics. At 70 cents per cake, it wasn't the absolute cheapest option, but it was special enough that women saved it for important church events and holidays. The burnt sugar flavor intensified as the cake sat, so making it the day before actually improved it. Kids were divided on this cake. Some loved the unique flavor, and others preferred plain chocolate, but adults always went back for seconds. The syrup technique required practice and careful attention, because if you burned the sugar too much, it turned bitter. But church ladies had made it so many times they could do it perfectly without even thinking. If you grew up in the South or Midwest, you probably remember these fruit dumplings being made in a big roasting pan and served warm at outdoor church picnics in the summertime. This wasn't a traditional dumpling like you'd have with chicken. These were more like individual fruit pies that cooked in their own sweet syrup. Women would roll out biscuit dough, cut it into squares, and wrap each square around a peach half or a handful of cherries that had been sprinkled with cinnamon and sugar. They'd pinch the dough closed around the fruit, place all the dumplings in a pan, then pour a mixture of butter, sugar, and water over everything before baking. As they cooked, the dough puffed up and turned golden, while the fruit inside softened and released its juice into the syrup. The result was individual pastries that were crispy on the outside and filled with hot, sweet fruit on the inside. At 65 cents per pan, these dumplings used whatever fruit was in season: peaches in late summer, cherries earlier in the year, or even apples in the fall. They were perfect for picnics because each person got their own dumpling, and you didn't need plates or forks if you wrapped them in wax paper. Women made them early in the morning, wrapped them individually, and they stayed warm for hours. The smell of baking fruit and cinnamon would make everyone hungry long before lunch was ready. These 5 desserts show how creative church ladies got with simple fruit, cream, and basic pantry ingredients. They turned sour cream into elegant Swedish desserts, burnt sugar into mysterious cakes, and fresh fruit into portable dumplings, all while keeping costs under $1 and feeding dozens of families. This cake was the ultimate fall church picnic dessert because it used up all those apples that were falling off trees in everyone's backyard and turning them into something absolutely incredible. The cake batter itself was simple: flour, sugar, eggs, oil, and lots of cinnamon. But the magic happened when you stirred in 3 or 4 cups of chopped apples. The batter was so thick with apple chunks that you could barely see the cake part, and that's exactly what made it perfect. During baking, the apples released their moisture into the cake, keeping it incredibly soft and almost pudding-like in the center. While the cake was still hot, you poured a brown sugar sauce made from butter, brown sugar, and cream over the top, and it soaked down into all the nooks and crannies between the apple pieces. At 70 cents per cake, this dessert was practically free if you had apple trees, or very cheap even if you bought apples from the store or farmer's market. The cake was so heavy and moist that it traveled beautifully to outdoor picnics without drying out, and it actually tasted better at room temperature than it did warm. Women baked it in 9x13 pans and cut it into large squares because the apple chunks made it very filling. One piece was plenty. Some families ate it for breakfast the next morning with coffee, claiming it was basically fruit and therefore healthy. The cinnamon smell while it baked would fill the entire church kitchen and make everyone ask what was in the oven. Now this cake is going to bring back memories for anyone who grew up in the 1950s, because orange chiffon cake was absolutely everywhere. It showed up at every fancy church event, wedding reception, and Easter dinner. What made it special was the light, fluffy texture that came from separating the eggs and folding in stiffly beaten egg whites at the end. The cake used vegetable oil instead of butter, which was a modern innovation at the time, and made it incredibly tender and moist. Fresh orange juice and grated orange zest gave it a bright citrus flavor that tasted refreshing and light, especially in warm weather. Church ladies baked it in tube pans so it rose tall and impressive, and they dust it with powdered sugar or add a simple orange glaze. At 65 cents per cake, it wasn't the cheapest option because of all those eggs, but it looked so elegant that women saved it for special occasions. The cake stayed fresh for 3 days, covered on the counter, and the orange flavor actually got stronger as it sat. What made it perfect for picnics was that it didn't need refrigeration, and it sliced beautifully without crumbling or falling apart. Kids loved the orange flavor because it wasn't too sweet, and adults appreciated how light it felt after a heavy potluck meal. The tall shape made it a showpiece on the dessert table, and women took pride in how high they could get their chiffon cakes to rise. Making a perfect chiffon cake was considered a sign of serious baking skill. Tell us, did orange chiffon cake show up at your church celebrations, or did your region prefer a different fancy cake? If you're not from Charleston, South Carolina, or the surrounding Lowcountry area, you've probably never heard of this dessert. But if you are from there, you're nodding right now because this showed up at every church supper, every wedding, and every fancy occasion. This torte is basically a crispy meringue cookie filled with chopped apples and pecans that bakes up crunchy on the outside and slightly soft on the inside. Despite the fancy French name, it only requires a handful of ingredients: eggs, sugar, apples, pecans, flour, baking powder, and vanilla. You beat the eggs with sugar until they're thick and fluffy, fold in everything else, and bake it until the top forms a golden crust. When it comes out of the oven, the torte looks flat and crispy, almost like you made a mistake, but that's exactly how it's supposed to be. You serve it in squares topped with whipped cream, and when people take a bite, they get crunchy meringue, soft apple pieces, and buttery pecans all at once. At 80 cents per pan, it was one of the more expensive church desserts because of all those pecans, but Charleston ladies considered it essential for any special occasion. The torte could sit at room temperature for hours without getting soggy, making it ideal for outdoor church picnics in humid southern weather. The dessert supposedly got its name from French Huguenots, who settled in Charleston centuries ago, though nobody knows if they actually made anything like this. What everyone does know is that it's a Charleston treasure that never spread much beyond the Low Country. Comment your location. Have you ever had Huguenot torte? Or is this a Charleston secret the rest of the country missed out on? This dessert was the absolute easiest thing any church lady could make when it was her turn to bring something to the picnic and she was running late. You dumped canned cherries into a baking pan, sprinkled them with an oat topping made from oats, butter, brown sugar, and flour, then baked it until everything bubbled and the top turned golden and crispy. That was it. No complicated steps, no fancy techniques, no expensive ingredients. During baking, the cherry juice bubbled up through the oat topping and created little pockets of sweet, tart fruit mixed with crunchy, buttery oats. At 55 cents per pan, this was one of the cheapest desserts you could make, especially in areas where cherries were grown locally and you could buy them cheaply. The crisp was best served warm, but it was still delicious at room temperature hours later at the picnic, and some people actually preferred it cold the next day. Women made it in aluminum foil pans that they could throw away after the picnic, which meant no dishes to wash and carry home. You could substitute other fruits, apples, peaches, blueberries, but cherry was the classic version that everyone loved. Kids would eat around the fruit to get to the crispy oat topping first, while adults appreciated the tartness of the cherries balanced with the sweet topping. The smell of baking fruit and brown sugar would make the whole church kitchen smell amazing. Cherry Crisp was proof that the simplest desserts were often the most popular. Did your region make fruit crisps with a different fruit? Now this dessert sounds fancy with that German name, but it was actually just a simple apple cake that Midwestern church ladies made for special occasions. The base was a sweetened cream cheese mixture spread in the bottom of a springform pan. Then you arranged sliced apples in a pretty pattern on top and sprinkled everything with cinnamon sugar before baking. Some versions added a pastry crust underneath, while others skipped it to save money and time. The cream cheese layer softened during baking and created a rich, tangy base that complemented the sweet apples perfectly. At 80 cents per torte, this was more expensive than most church desserts because of the cream cheese and the sheer quantity of apples you needed to cover the top. But it looked so impressive that women made it when they wanted to show off their baking skills. The torte had to be made in a springform pan so you could remove the sides and show off the beautiful apple design on top. It transported well because the cream cheese base held everything together firmly, and it sliced cleanly without falling apart. The combination of tangy cream cheese, sweet apples, and warm cinnamon made this taste like a cross between cheesecake and apple pie. Some women added a streusel topping for extra crunch and sweetness. This was definitely a German-influenced recipe that was most popular in areas with large German immigrant populations: Wisconsin, Minnesota, and parts of Pennsylvania. This cake was absolutely genius because it used a jar of applesauce to replace both the oil and the eggs, which made it incredibly cheap to make and perfect for families on tight budgets. During the 1950s, every farm wife had shelves full of home-canned applesauce from their apple trees, so this cake cost practically nothing to bake. You mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice together, then stirred in the applesauce until you had a thick, fragrant batter. Some women added raisins or chopped walnuts for extra texture, but the basic version was just the spiced cake by itself. What made this cake absolutely perfect for church picnics was that it stayed incredibly moist for days without any frosting at all. The applesauce kept the crumbs soft and tender, and the spices made it smell amazing. At just 50 cents per cake, this was one of the absolute cheapest desserts any woman could bring to a church event, and yet it always got compliments because it tasted so warm and comforting. Women baked it in rectangular pans, let it cool completely, then dusted the top with powdered sugar for a simple presentation. The cake traveled beautifully because it was sturdy and didn't crumble when you cut it into squares. Kids loved it because the spices made it taste like fall and holidays, and adults loved it because it wasn't too sweet and paired perfectly with coffee. Some families ate leftover applesauce cake for breakfast the next morning, spreading butter on it like they would with toast. The cake actually improved as it sat because all the spices had time to blend together and develop deeper flavors. Women who were known for their applesauce cake would get requests to bring it to every single church function throughout the year. The recipe was so simple that even young girls just learning to bake could make it successfully without supervision. During World War II and the Depression, this cake had been even more popular because it didn't require rationed ingredients like butter or eggs. And that frugal tradition carried right through into the 1950s and 60s. Some churches published the recipe in their community cookbooks under different names: poverty cake, war cake, or depression cake. But they were all basically the same applesauce spice cake that grandmothers had been making for generations. The warm spice aroma while it baked would fill the entire house and make everyone gather in the kitchen asking when it would be ready. Comment below and tell us, did your grandma make applesauce spice cake, or did she have a different name for this simple spiced cake that used up all that home-canned applesauce? Now this pie is going to split the country completely in half. If you grew up anywhere in the Deep South, you know exactly what this is. But if you're from anywhere else, you've probably never heard of it in your entire life. This rich custard pie was filled with dates, raisins, pecans, and warm spices, and it was named after the President of the Confederacy, which tells you right away that this is a serious Southern tradition. You made the filling by beating eggs with sugar and butter, then stirring in chopped dates, raisins, pecans, cinnamon, and nutmeg before pouring everything into an unbaked pie shell. During baking, the eggs set into a custard that held all the fruit and nuts together in a sweet, spiced filling that was incredibly rich and satisfying. The pie tasted like a cross between pecan pie and fruitcake, but better than both because the custard wasn't too sweet and the spices weren't overwhelming. At 85 cents per pie, this was one of the more expensive church desserts because of all those pecans and dried fruits, but Southern ladies considered it essential for holidays and special church events. The pie was sturdy enough to slice cleanly and serve at outdoor picnics without falling apart, and it didn't need refrigeration even in warm weather. Some families served it with whipped cream on top, but most people ate it plain because the filling was already so rich and flavorful. The combination of chewy dates and raisins with crunchy pecans gave every bite different textures, and the warm spices made it taste festive and special. Women usually made this pie for Christmas, Thanksgiving, and Easter church dinners rather than regular summer picnics, because it felt like a holiday dessert. The recipe had been passed down through Southern families for generations, with each family claiming their version was the authentic original. Some versions used all dates, some used all raisins, and some used a combination of both, but they all included pecans because that's what made it Southern. The pie got its name sometime in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and by the 1950s, it had become a traditional part of Southern church cookbook collections. Making Jefferson Davis pie was considered a sign that you knew authentic Southern baking, not just the popular desserts that everyone made. The pie was so rich that most people could only eat a small slice, which meant one pie served more people than you'd expect. This cake has one of the most interesting stories of any church dessert, because every single ingredient came from a specific Bible verse, and women had to know their scripture well enough to figure out the recipe. The recipe would be written as a puzzle. For example, it would say 1 cup Judges 5:25, which is butter, 3 cups Jeremiah 6:20, which is sugar, 6 of Jeremiah 17:11, which is eggs, and so on through every ingredient. Church ladies would challenge each other to decode the recipe using only their Bibles, and it became a fun activity at ladies' auxiliary meetings. Once you figured out all the ingredients, you ended up with a dense, dark fruitcake packed with raisins, figs, almonds, honey, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. The cake was similar to traditional fruitcake, but heavier and more bread-like in texture. At 90 cents per cake, this was the single most expensive dessert on this entire list because of all those dried fruits and nuts. But women made it for Christmas and Easter when they wanted something truly special. The cake took hours to bake at a low temperature, and it actually improved with age. Some women made it weeks ahead and brushed it with fruit juice or even a little wine to keep it moist. Despite its fancy presentation and biblical theme, scripture cake traveled beautifully to church picnics because it was so dense and sturdy that nothing could damage it. You could drop it and it would probably survive without a dent. The cake sliced into neat squares that held together perfectly, making it easy to serve outdoors. Kids were usually not fans of scripture cake because of all the dried fruit, but adults loved it with coffee or tea. The recipe appeared in almost every single church cookbook published between 1920 and 1970, always with the Bible verse puzzle format. Some churches held scripture cake baking contests where women would compete to see who could bake the best version, and the judging was serious business. The tradition of using Bible verses to hide the recipe made it feel spiritual and connected to church community, which is probably why it stayed popular for so long. By the 1980s, scripture cake mostly disappeared because younger generations didn't enjoy fruitcake the way their grandmothers had, and the Bible verse puzzle seemed old-fashioned. But in the 1950s, every church lady worth her salt knew how to decode scripture cake and had her own special version. These spice drop cookies have been around since the 1800s, and they were still going strong at every 1950s church picnic because they traveled well, stayed fresh forever, and tasted absolutely incredible. The name Hermit supposedly came from the idea that these cookies were so good you should hide them away like a hermit to keep them all for yourself, though some people say it's because they improved with age when stored in a sealed tin. The cookies were packed with raisins, chopped walnuts or pecans, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice that made them taste like fall and Christmas. The dough came together quickly. You creamed butter and brown sugar, added eggs and molasses, then stirred in flour and all those spices and mix-ins. You dropped spoonfuls onto cookie sheets and baked them until they were golden brown and slightly crispy on the edges, but still soft in the center. At 60 cents per batch, making 4 dozen cookies, these were economical enough to feed a crowd, but special enough that people always wanted more. What made Hermit cookies absolutely perfect for church picnics was their durability. You could bake them 3 days ahead, pack them in tins or jars, and they'd still taste fresh when you served them. Some women claimed the cookies actually tasted better after sitting for a day or two because the spices mellowed and blended together. The molasses gave them a deep, rich flavor and a dark color that made them look rustic and homemade. Kids loved finding the raisins hidden throughout each cookie, and adults appreciated the complex spice blend that wasn't too sweet. These cookies were substantial enough that 2 or 3 would satisfy anyone's dessert craving, unlike lighter cookies that people ate by the handful. Women often made double batches because they knew the cookies would disappear fast at church events, and they wanted to keep some at home for their families. Hermit cookies showed up in church cookbooks across the entire country, from New England to the South to the Midwest, with each region claiming their version was the original. The recipe was forgiving enough that you could substitute different dried fruits or nuts based on what you had available. Some women used dried currants instead of raisins, or added chopped dates for extra sweetness. The cookies packed beautifully for mailing, so women often sent them to family members in the military or college students away from home. If there's one dessert that shows up in literally every single church cookbook from the 1950s, it's date bars, also called date squares, or, in some regions, matrimonial cake, which we already talked about. These bars were the perfect church picnic dessert because they were sturdy, portable, not too sweet, and they used dates, which were cheap and available year-round. You made a crumbly oat mixture from oats, flour, brown sugar, and butter that you pressed into the bottom of a pan. Then you spread a thick layer of cooked date filling on top, and finally you crumbled more of the oat mixture over everything. During baking, the top and bottom layers turned golden and crispy, while the date filling stayed soft and sweet in the middle. The contrast between crunchy oats and smooth dates made every bite interesting. At 65 cents per pan, these bars were affordable enough to make regularly, but special enough that people always looked forward to them. The date filling was simple to make. You just cooked chopped dates with water and a little sugar until they broke down into a thick paste. Some women added lemon juice or orange zest to brighten the flavor, while others kept it plain and let the natural sweetness of the dates shine through. Date bars sliced cleanly into perfect squares that you could wrap individually in wax paper for easy serving at outdoor picnics. They stayed fresh at room temperature for days, which made them ideal for bake sales and church fundraisers. Kids had mixed feelings about date bars. Some loved them and others picked at the date filling suspiciously, but adults almost universally enjoyed them, especially with coffee. The bars were filling enough that one square was usually plenty, which meant a single pan fed a lot of people. Women who were really good at making date bars had a special technique for getting the oat layers crispy without burning them and keeping the date filling from getting too dry. The recipe was so popular that dates became a pantry staple in most American homes, even though people rarely ate them on their own. During World War II, date bars had been popular because they didn't require rationed ingredients, and that tradition carried straight through into the 1950s and beyond. Some families ate date bars for breakfast with coffee, claiming the oats and fruit made them healthy and appropriate for morning. The bars were particularly popular in areas with large Scandinavian populations, though the recipe eventually spread nationwide through church cookbooks. Comment your location and tell us, were date bars a staple at your church, or is this one of those desserts that was more popular in some regions than others? These 5 desserts represent the absolute pinnacle of 1950s church baking, from Bible verse cakes to hermit cookies that lasted for weeks. Church ladies turned simple ingredients like applesauce, dates, and spices into desserts that fed communities, celebrated faith, and created memories that lasted for generations. Now, if you've never heard of Rock's cookies, you're probably trying to figure out why anyone would name a dessert after something you'd find on the ground. But if you grew up eating these, you know exactly why they got that name. They're lumpy, bumpy, irregular drop cookies loaded with so many raisins, nuts, and spices that they barely hold together, and they look like rough little rocks sitting on the cookie sheet. These cookies have been around since at least the 1800s, making them one of the oldest cookie recipes still being made in the 1950s, and they were absolute staples at church picnics because they traveled well and tasted better after sitting for a day or two. The dough was thick and packed with chopped raisins, chopped walnuts or pecans, sometimes shredded coconut, and always a blend of warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and allspice. You dropped rough spoonfuls onto baking sheets without smoothing them out, which is how they got their characteristic rocky appearance. At 55 cents per batch, making about 4 dozen cookies, these were economical enough to make in huge quantities for church events while still tasting special and homemade. What made Rock's cookies different from other fruit and nut cookies was their texture. They were dense and chewy, almost like eating a piece of fruitcake in cookie form, and they were substantial enough that 2 or 3 cookies felt like a real dessert. Women loved making these because the dough was very forgiving and you couldn't mess them up. Irregular shapes and sizes were expected and actually made them look more authentic. The cookies stayed fresh for weeks when stored in tins, which made them perfect for baking ahead or mailing to distant family members. Some recipes added a little molasses or brown sugar for deeper flavor, while others kept the dough lighter with just white sugar and butter. Kids had strong opinions about Rock's cookies. They either loved them or hated them, depending on how they felt about raisins and nuts, but adults consistently enjoyed them with coffee or tea. These cookies were particularly popular during the Christmas season, when women were doing marathon baking sessions and needed recipes that produced large quantities without fussiness. The name Rock's appeared in cookbooks as early as the 1890s, which means grandmothers in the 1950s were baking the exact same recipe their own grandmothers had made 60 years earlier. Some families had special variations passed down through generations: extra cinnamon or candied cherries added to the mix, or a drizzle of thin icing on top after baking. The cookies were substantial enough to pack for school lunches, and they didn't crumble into dust in lunchboxes like more delicate cookies. Church cookbook committees always included at least one Rock's cookie recipe because they knew it was a tested classic that everyone recognized. Tell us below, did Rock's cookies show up at your church picnics? Or is this an old-fashioned recipe that had already disappeared by the time you were growing up? These soft, chewy cookies with their distinctive crackled sugar coating were absolutely everywhere in the 1950s. Every church bake sale, every holiday cookie plate, every grandmother's cookie jar had molasses crinkles. They got their name from the way the surface cracked and wrinkled during baking, creating a beautiful pattern on top that made them look fancy even though they were simple to make. The cookies were flavored with molasses and warm spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, giving them a deep, complex taste that wasn't too sweet. You made the dough by creaming together shortening, brown sugar, and molasses, then adding an egg and dry ingredients, including all those wonderful spices. After chilling the dough, you rolled it into balls, rolled each ball in white sugar, and baked them until they puffed up and then crackled on top. At 50 cents per batch, making about 3 dozen cookies, these were one of the absolute cheapest desserts you could make, and yet they looked so pretty with their sugar coating and crinkled tops that they seemed special. What made molasses crinkles perfect for church picnics was their soft, chewy texture that stayed perfect for days. They never got hard or dried out like some cookies. The molasses kept them moist and tender even after sitting in a covered container for a week. Kids loved the sugar coating and the mild spice flavor that wasn't too strong, while adults appreciated the nostalgic taste that reminded them of their own childhoods. These cookies were particularly popular during fall and winter when people craved warm spices, but they showed up at church events year-round because they were so reliable and well-loved. Women could mix up a batch in 15 minutes and have fresh cookies ready in under half an hour, which made them perfect for last-minute baking emergencies. The recipe was so standard that most experienced bakers didn't even need to look at a recipe card. They just knew the proportions by heart after making them dozens of times. Some women added a little extra ginger for more spice kick, while others kept the spices mild for children's preferences. The cookies baked up soft and cake-like in the center with slightly crispy edges, and that textural contrast made them irresistible. Church ladies would make triple batches because they knew these cookies disappeared faster than almost anything else on the dessert table. The crinkled appearance made them photogenic enough that they often appeared in church cookbook photographs and on promotional materials for bake sales. During the Depression, molasses crinkles had been popular because molasses was cheaper than sugar, and by the 1950s, the cookie had become such a tradition that no one would think of stopping. Some families dunked them in milk, others ate them with coffee, and kids just grabbed them by the handful. Were molasses crinkles a staple in your family's cookie rotation? Now this cake is going to make Southerners incredibly nostalgic, and everyone else completely confused, because blackberry jam cake is a serious Southern tradition that never really traveled much beyond Kentucky, Tennessee, and surrounding states. This was a dark, spiced layer cake that used blackberry jam stirred right into the batter, along with buttermilk, warm spices, and sometimes a little cocoa powder for depth. The jam added moisture, color, and a subtle fruit flavor that made the cake incredibly special. Church ladies made this as a layer cake with caramel frosting or cream cheese frosting for important occasions, or as a sheet cake with just powdered sugar for regular picnics. At 75 cents per cake, it wasn't the absolute cheapest option because of the jam and the buttermilk, but it was special enough that women saved it for celebrations and holiday gatherings. The cake had a dense, moist crumb that held up beautifully for days, and the flavors actually improved as it sat because the spices had time to mellow and blend together. You made the batter by creaming butter and sugar, adding eggs, then alternating dry ingredients with buttermilk while folding in the blackberry jam at the end. The jam didn't blend in smoothly. It stayed in streaks throughout the batter, which created beautiful purple ribbons in the finished cake. Some recipes added raisins or chopped pecans for extra texture, while others kept it simple and let the blackberry flavor shine. During baking, the jam caramelized slightly where it touched the pan, creating pockets of intense berry flavor. The cake smelled absolutely incredible, like warm spices and baking fruit, and the aroma would drift through the entire church fellowship hall. Kids were sometimes skeptical because they couldn't see the berries and didn't understand what jam cake meant, but once they tasted it, they were converted. The combination of buttermilk tang, sweet jam, and warm spices made this taste completely different from any other cake. Southern families passed jam cake recipes down through generations, with each family claiming their version was the authentic, traditional one. Some used only blackberry jam, others mixed blackberry with raspberry or strawberry, and a few rebellious bakers even used peach preserves. The cake was traditional for Christmas and weddings, but it also showed up at church homecoming celebrations and fall festivals. Making jam cake from scratch was considered a sign of serious Southern baking credentials. This wasn't a recipe for beginners. The cake required careful balancing of flavors and the right amount of spice so it wasn't overwhelming, and experienced bakers developed a feel for the perfect consistency. These slice-and-bake cookies were absolute genius for church ladies who needed to bake large quantities without spending all day in the kitchen. The name icebox cookies came from the fact that you made the dough ahead of time, shaped it into logs, and stored it in the icebox, what we'd call the refrigerator, until you were ready to bake. When it was time to make cookies, you just sliced the cold dough into rounds and baked them. No rolling, no cookie cutters, no fuss. The basic recipe used butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and vanilla, with chopped pecans or walnuts pressed into the outside of the logs for decoration and crunch. At 60 cents per batch, making 5 or 6 dozen cookies, depending on how thick you sliced them, these were economical and efficient for feeding crowds. What made icebox cookies perfect for church events was that you could make the dough 3 days ahead and keep it chilled, then bake fresh cookies the morning of the picnic so they'd still be slightly warm when you arrived. The cookies themselves were crisp, buttery, and simple. Nothing fancy, just pure butter cookie flavor with a nutty crunch around the edges. Some women made multiple flavors by dividing the dough and adding different mix-ins: chocolate chips to one log, coconut to another, dried fruit to a third, so they could offer variety without making completely different recipes. The cookies baked quickly and evenly because they were all uniform thickness, which meant you could produce dozens and dozens in a short time. Kids loved the simple vanilla flavor and the fact that each cookie looked perfect and professional, while adults appreciated the buttery richness and the satisfying crunch. These cookies stayed fresh for over a week when stored in tins, which made them ideal for bake sales where they might sit for several days before selling. The dough logs could even be frozen for months, which meant organized church ladies kept dough in their freezers year-round for baking emergencies. Some women got creative with shapes. Instead of round logs, they'd make square or triangular dough blocks that sliced into fancy shapes. The edges could be rolled in colored sugar for holidays, making them festive without extra effort. Icebox cookies represented modern 1950s efficiency, making ahead, storing conveniently, and producing perfect results with minimal effort. And church ladies loved anything that saved time while still looking homemade. The technique was taught in home economics classes and spread through community cookbooks until every baker knew how to make icebox cookies. This is the grand finale, the dessert that absolutely everyone remembers from 1950s church picnics, the one that caused friendly competition between church ladies who each claimed theirs was the best. Sour cream coffee cake wasn't technically a cake at all. It was more like a sweet bread with a thick ribbon of cinnamon sugar nut filling running through the middle and a generous crumb topping covering the entire surface. At 70 cents per cake, this wasn't the absolute cheapest option, but it was such a crowd favorite that women made it anyway and considered it money well spent. The cake batter was tender and moist thanks to the sour cream, which added tang and richness that butter alone couldn't provide. You made the batter by creaming butter and sugar, adding eggs and sour cream, then gently folding in flour mixed with baking powder and baking soda. The filling was simply cinnamon mixed with brown sugar and chopped pecans or walnuts, and you created layers by putting half the batter in the pan, sprinkling the filling over it, adding the rest of the batter, and topping everything with more filling plus a buttery crumb mixture. During baking, the filling melted into ribbons throughout the cake, and the crumb topping turned golden and crunchy. The finished cake was absolutely beautiful, tall and impressive, with a thick, streusel-like topping that looked bakery quality. What made this perfect for church picnics was that it was sturdy enough to transport easily. It didn't need frosting that would melt in warm weather, and it sliced cleanly into perfect squares that were easy to serve. The cake stayed incredibly moist for 3 or 4 days, and many people claimed it actually tasted better on day 2 after all the flavors had time to develop. You could serve it for breakfast, dessert, or afternoon snack. Coffee cake was appropriate for any time of day. Church ladies baked it in 9x13 pans for picnics, or in tube pans for fancier presentations at holiday gatherings. The smell while it baked was absolutely intoxicating. Butter, cinnamon, and cake all combining to create an aroma that made everyone ask when it would be ready. This was the cake that showed up at every single church function, every bake sale, every ladies' auxiliary meeting, and every potluck dinner throughout the entire decade. Women swapped variations. Some added a glazed drizzle, others mixed in blueberries or apples. A few adventurous bakers tried chocolate chips, but the classic cinnamon nut version remained the gold standard, making a perfect sour cream coffee cake with an even filling ribbon and a thick, crunchy topping was considered a mark of baking expertise, and women took pride in their technique. Tell us in the comments, was sour cream coffee cake the absolute star of your church picnics, or did your region have a different coffee cake that was even more popular? These 30 forgotten church picnic desserts represent an entire era of American community life that vanished between 1950 and 1980. Church ladies created incredible cakes, pies, cookies, and bars for under $1, using simple pantry ingredients, feeding entire congregations without breaking family budgets. Scripture cake required Bible knowledge to decode. Funeral pie marked Amish gatherings. Huguenot torte stayed locked in Charleston. By the 1980s, store-bought bakery items and convenience culture replaced these homemade traditions. The recipes survived only in spiral-bound church cookbooks, gathering dust in attic boxes. These desserts weren't just food, they were edible proof of faith, community, and resourcefulness that modern America forgot.